The morning mist clung to the foothills of the Smoky Mountains like a shroud, thick and deliberate, as if the land itself were hiding secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Along the Hiwassee River, where the water ran cold and clear over ancient stones, the boundary between two worlds had always been fragile, a line drawn in sand that shifted with every season, every treaty broken, every life caught between. Margaret Whitford had never been one to respect boundaries. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that her father, Colonel Benjamin Whitford, wielded like currency: pale skin that had never known field work, dark hair that cascaded in careful ringlets, and eyes the color of Tennessee clay after rain. She was his prize, his investment, the daughter who would seal alliances with other plantation families and ensure the Whitford name endured for generations. But Margaret had always preferred the wild edges of their 1,200-acre estate to the suffocating parlors, where her future was negotiated over bourbon and cigars. That April afternoon, she had slipped away from the main house, while her mother entertained the wives of neighboring planters, their conversation a drone of complaints about the quality of house slaves and the rising cost of cotton. What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you. Margaret had taken a basket and headed toward the river, claiming she needed wildflowers for the dinner table. It was a lie her mother accepted because it kept Margaret occupied and visible. A daughter gathering flowers was still a daughter under control. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and wet earth. Dogwood blossoms had erupted across the hillside like snow that refused to melt, and Margaret moved through them with practiced ease, her pale blue dress catching on brambles she barely noticed. She had walked this path 100 times, knew every root and stone, every place where the ground dipped toward hidden springs. But she had never walked it alone before. Her father had forbidden it after the Indian Removal Act had forced most of the Cherokee from their ancestral lands 3 years prior. The few who remained, those who had hidden in the mountains or refused to march westward on what people were already calling the Trail of Tears, were considered dangerous, desperate, unpredictable. Colonel Whitford had made his position clear at dinner just last week, his voice booming over the roasted quail and sweet potatoes. A Cherokee in these woods is either a thief or worse. Any man sees one on Whitford land has my permission to shoot on sight. Margaret had said nothing, but she had thought plenty. She had seen the families driven from their homes, had watched from her bedroom window as soldiers herded them past the plantation gates like cattle. She had seen a mother carrying a child who would not wake up, and a grandfather who had walked until his feet bled through his moccasins. Her silence had been mistaken for agreement. It was actually shame. The river was higher than usual, swollen with spring rain that had turned the current from lazy to insistent. Margaret knelt beside a patch of purple trillium, setting down her basket and reaching for the delicate blooms. The sound of rushing water filled her ears, drowning out everything else. The distant songs from the slave quarters, the crack of an overseer's whip, the mechanical rhythm of plantation life. She didn't hear the warning. The rattlesnake had been sunning itself on a flat rock half hidden by tall grass, its thick body coiled in perfect camouflage among the dried leaves and shadows. It was a timber rattler, nearly 4 feet long, its pattern of dark chevrons making it almost invisible until it moved. Margaret's hand reached for a cluster of flowers growing near the rock. Her shadow fell across the snake's coil. The strike was faster than thought. She felt the impact first, a sharp punching sensation just above her ankle, and then the pain bloomed hot and immediate, radiating up her leg like fire spreading through dry wood. Margaret screamed, stumbling backward, her basket overturning and spilling flowers into the mud. The snake remained coiled, its rattle buzzing a warning that came too late, its triangular head still raised in threat position. Margaret's scream echoed across the water, bouncing off the limestone bluffs and disappearing into the dense forest. She fell hard, her hands scrambling at her skirts, trying to see the wound through the layers of petticoats and cotton. Blood was already seeping through the white fabric of her stocking, 2 perfect puncture marks just above the leather of her boot. Panic seized her throat. She had seen a field hand die from a rattlesnake bite 2 summers ago, watched his leg swell to twice its size, watched the venom turn his skin black, watched him thrash and foam, and finally go still while the doctor stood by helplessly, saying there was nothing to be done once the poison reached the heart. She tried to stand, but her leg buckled. The pain was spreading, a deep, throbbing ache that made her stomach turn. She could feel her heartbeat in the wound, each pulse pushing the venom deeper into her body. "Help!" she called out, but her voice was weak, swallowed by the sound of the river. "Someone help me!" The forest remained silent, except for the wind moving through new leaves and the distant call of a crow. Margaret's vision began to blur at the edges. She pressed her hands against the ground, trying to steady herself, but the world tilted dangerously. She was going to die here, she realized, alone by the river, with flowers scattered around her like funeral decorations. Then she heard footsteps. They were quick and purposeful, moving through the underbrush with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. Margaret's relief lasted only a moment before fear replaced it. What if it was one of the men her father had warned about? What if she had traded a snake's venom for something worse? The figure that emerged from the tree line was not what she expected. He was tall and lean, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His skin was the color of copper in firelight, his black hair long and tied back with a strip of leather. He wore deerskin leggings and a simple shirt that might have once been white, but was now stained with travel and weather. His eyes, dark and watchful, took in the scene immediately. The overturned basket, the snake still coiled on its rock, and Margaret clutching her bleeding ankle. For a long moment they simply stared at each other across 10 feet of riverbank. Margaret knew she should be afraid. Her father's warnings rang in her ears. But all she could feel was a desperate animal hope that this stranger might be able to help her. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The snake!" He moved before she finished speaking. In 3 strides he was beside her, kneeling in the mud without hesitation. His hands, calloused and strong, grasped her ankle gently but firmly, turning it to examine the wound. Margaret gasped at his touch, not from pain, but from the transgression of it. No man outside her family had ever touched her bare skin. "Timber rattler," he said, his English accented but clear. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that did not waste words. "How long?" "Just now," Margaret managed. "Just moments ago." He nodded once, his jaw tightening. Then he did something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. He lowered his head to her leg. "What are you—" She started but stopped when she understood. His mouth sealed over the wound, his lips pressing against her skin with urgent precision. Margaret felt the suction, felt him drawing on the puncture marks, pulling the venom from her flesh. It was intimate in a way that made her face burn despite the circumstances. She could feel his breath, hot against her calf, could feel the slight scrape of stubble, could feel the strange tenderness of an act that was both violent and saving. He spit blood and venom onto the ground, then returned to the wound, repeating the process. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time he spit, the mixture on the ground grew darker, thicker. Margaret watched his face as he worked, the concentration in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hands held her leg steady with surprising gentleness. There was no hesitation in him. No disgust, only a fierce determination to draw out every drop of poison before it could reach her heart. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, he sat back on his heels, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Most of it is out," he said. "But you need a doctor. You need to go home now." Margaret tried to stand but swayed dangerously. He caught her elbow, steadying her, and for a moment they were close enough that she could smell wood smoke and leather and something else, pine maybe, or cedar. "I don't think I can walk," she admitted. Without a word, he bent and scooped her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. Margaret stiffened in shock. She had been carried as a child, but never as a woman, never by a man who was not her father or brother. The impropriety of it should have made her protest, but the alternative was dying by the river, so she wrapped one arm around his neck and said nothing. He carried her through the woods with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew every hidden path. Margaret's head rested against his shoulder, her mind swimming with pain and shock and something else she could not name. She studied his profile, the strong nose, the high cheekbones, the way his eyes scanned the forest constantly, alert to danger she could not see. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, "Nokosi. Nokosi," she repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. "What does it mean?" "Bear." It suited him, she thought. There was something bear-like in his strength, his protective instinct, his solitary presence in these woods. "I'm Margaret," she offered. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Colonel Whitford's daughter, the one who watches from the windows." Heat flooded her face. She had not realized anyone had noticed her watching, had not thought her small acts of witness mattered to anyone. They reached the edge of the forest, where the manicured lawns of the plantation began. Nokosi stopped, setting her down carefully, but keeping a hand on her arm until he was sure she could stand. "Go," he said. "Tell them you were bitten. Tell them you got yourself home. But you saved—" "Tell them nothing about me," he interrupted, his voice urgent now, almost fierce. "For both our sakes, tell them nothing." Before Margaret could respond, he was gone, disappearing back into the trees, as if he had never been there at all. She stood alone at the forest's edge, her leg throbbing, her dress muddy and torn, her mind reeling from what had just happened. In the distance, she could see the white columns of the main house, could hear the faint sounds of afternoon life on the plantation, the clang of a dinner bell, the voice of her mother calling for someone, the ordinary sounds of a world that suddenly felt very far away. Margaret took a shaky breath and began to limp toward home, each step sending jolts of pain up her leg. But it was not the venom that made her heart race. It was the memory of a Cherokee man's hands holding her steady, his mouth on her skin, drawing poison and leaving something far more dangerous in its wake. By the time she reached the house, her mother was already running toward her, skirts lifted, face white with alarm. And Margaret knew that no matter what she said or did not say, nothing would ever be the same. The venom had been only the beginning. The fever came that night. Margaret lay in her bed, the heavy curtains drawn against the sunset, while Dr. Abernathy examined the bite. He was a thin man with spectacles that constantly slid down his long nose, and he had been the Whitford family physician for nearly 2 decades. He had delivered Margaret into this world and had treated every childhood illness since, but he had never seen her look quite like this, flushed and trembling, her eyes too bright, her breath coming quick and shallow. "The puncture marks are clean," he murmured, more to himself than to the anxious parents hovering nearby. "Surprisingly clean, and most of the venom appears to have been extracted." Colonel Whitford stepped closer, his bulk filling the doorway. He was a massive man, over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that had once been muscular but had softened into the prosperous thickness of middle age. His face was ruddy from years of bourbon and sun, his sideburns graying at the temples. He wore his authority like other men wore coats, constantly, comfortably, and with the absolute certainty that it fit him perfectly. "Extracted?" he repeated. "How?" "The girl said she walked herself home." Dr. Abernathy glanced at Margaret, who had closed her eyes and said nothing. The doctor had his suspicions. He had seen snake-bite wounds before, and he knew the distinctive pattern of suction marks when he saw them, but he also knew when questions were better left unasked in a house like this. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the initial strike does not deliver a full dose of venom. It's possible the snake had recently fed. Possible it was a dry bite. Possible many things. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was the kind of lie that allowed life to continue, and so they all accepted it. "She needs rest," the doctor continued, mixing a tincture of laudanum with practiced hands. "Fluids, cool compresses for the fever. The next 48 hours are critical. If she survives them, she should recover fully." If she survives. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's mother, Eleanor Whitford, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. She was a delicate woman who had learned early in her marriage that strength was measured in silence, that the art of being a plantation wife meant knowing which battles to fight and which to let her husband win. She had fought none and won nothing, and it showed in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands never quite stopped trembling. "Someone should stay with her," Eleanor whispered. "I'll have Bessie sit with her through the night," Colonel Whitford decided. "And post a man outside the door. If she worsens, fetch me immediately." He spoke as if Margaret were not in the room, as if her fever had already transported her somewhere beyond hearing. Perhaps it had. Her mind felt loose and untethered, floating somewhere between the four-poster bed and the ceiling, watching the scene below with detached curiosity. She saw her father lean down and press a kiss to her forehead, a rare gesture of affection that he would never make if she were fully conscious. She saw her mother hover, wanting to touch, but not knowing how. She saw Dr. Abernathy close his medical bag with a decisive click that sounded like a door shutting. Then they were gone, and Bessie was there instead. Bessie was 43 years old and had belonged to the Whitford family since she was 16, purchased at an estate sale in Nashville, assigned to the house staff, and eventually elevated to the position of Eleanor Whitford's personal maid. She moved through the plantation house like a ghost, silent and efficient, knowing instinctively where she was needed before anyone asked. She had also been the one to teach Margaret how to walk along the river paths without being seen, how to find the places where the boundaries blurred. Now she sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed, her dark hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable in the lamplight. "Child," she said softly once they were truly alone, "what really happened?" Margaret's eyes opened. The laudanum was beginning to work, softening the edges of pain, but her mind was still sharp enough to understand the question behind the question. "A snake bit me," she whispered. "I know that much. What I'm asking is who helped you?" Silence stretched between them. Outside, night sounds filtered through the window, crickets and tree frogs, the distant hoot of an owl, the restless movement of horses in the stable. "If I tell you," Margaret said finally, "you'll be in danger too." Bessie's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "Been in danger my whole life, Miss Margaret. One more secret won't make much difference." So Margaret told her. Every detail, from the snake's strike to Nokosi's appearance, from the intimacy of his mouth on her skin to his warning to say nothing. The words spilled out in a fever rush, part confession and part desperate need to make someone else understand what had happened, to anchor the memory in something real before the laudanum pulled her under completely. When she finished, Bessie was quiet for a long time. "Nokosi," she repeated slowly. "Cherokee name, means bear. You know him?" "Know of him." Bessie rose and moved to the window, checking that the curtains were fully closed before returning. "He used to come around the quarters sometimes, brought medicine when folks were sick, helped Jimmy's boy when he cut his leg near to the bone, never asked for nothing in return." "Why would he help?" Margaret asked. "My father has done nothing but try to drive his people away." Bessie's smile was sad. "Some people help because it's who they are, not because of who you are, but that don't make it safe. Your father finds out a Cherokee man touched you, Put his mouth on you." She shook her head. "They'll hunt him like an animal." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the venom. "Then we won't tell them." "Oh, child." Bessie returned to the chair, her voice gentle but firm. "This ain't a secret you can keep. The doctor knows something happened. Your father already suspects. And if that fever in you is anything like what I'm seeing in your eyes, it ain't just poison you're burning with." The words hit Margaret like a slap. Was it that obvious? Could everyone see what she barely admitted to herself, that something had shifted in those moments by the river, that Nokosi's hands on her skin had awakened something she had no name for? "I'm grateful," she said defensively. "He saved my life. Is gratitude a crime now? In this house, when it's directed at a Cherokee man?" Bessie's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, child. That kind of gratitude will get you both killed." The laudanum pulled Margaret down into dark water then, dragging her under before she could respond. The last thing she heard was Bessie humming softly, an old song from somewhere else, something that sounded like mourning and hope mixed together. Margaret dreamed of rivers and rattlesnakes, of hands the color of copper and eyes that saw through her in ways no one else ever had. She dreamed of her father's rage and her mother's fear, of boundaries drawn in blood and treaties written on lies. She dreamed of the taste of venom and the touch of salvation, and somewhere in the fever dark of her mind she could not tell which was which. When she woke near dawn, the fever had broken. Bessie was asleep in the chair, her chin dropped to her chest. Through the window, Margaret could see the first pale light touching the tops of the trees, turning the morning mist to gold. Her leg still throbbed, but the pain was manageable now. The wound was already beginning to close, the angry red fading to pink. She would have scars, 2 small marks just above her ankle that would remain for the rest of her life. But scars, Margaret thought, were sometimes the only proof that you had survived something worth remembering. She lay still, listening to the plantation wake around her. The bells rang for morning work. The kitchen fires were lit. The slaves began their daily movements through the yards and fields, a choreographed dance of labor that had been perfected over generations of bondage. And somewhere out there, beyond the manicured lawns and cotton fields, beyond the boundaries of Colonel Whitford's 1,200 acres, Nokosi was probably watching the same sunrise from the forest Margaret was not supposed to enter. She wondered if he was thinking about her. She wondered if he knew what he had started. 3 days later, when Margaret was well enough to come down to dinner, her father made an announcement that turned her blood cold. They were seated in the formal dining room, the table laden with ham and sweet potatoes and cornbread, the silver gleaming in candlelight. Margaret's brother Thomas was home from the university in Knoxville, and several neighbors had been invited, the Harrigans from the adjacent property and Judge Blackwell, who owned a smaller but equally prosperous plantation 5 miles down the river. Colonel Whitford stood at the head of the table, his wineglass raised. "I want to thank you all for your concern during Margaret's recent ordeal," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to being heard. "It reminded me of how fragile our security is, how the wilderness still presses against us, how we must remain vigilant." Eleanor reached for Margaret's hand under the table, squeezing once in warning. Margaret's stomach turned. "To that end," the colonel continued, "I've hired additional men to patrol our borders. I've also put out word that there's a reward for any Cherokee found trespassing on Whitford land. $50, dead or alive." The table erupted in murmurs of approval. Judge Blackwell nodded sagely. Thomas raised his own glass. The Harrigans exchanged satisfied looks. Margaret could not breathe. $50. In a county where most families lived on far less, that sum would be impossible to resist. Men would hunt the forest for weeks for that kind of money. And Nokosi, who had helped slaves, who had saved her life, who had shown her more humanity in 5 minutes than her father had in 19 years, would be the prize they sought. "You look pale, sister," Thomas observed from across the table. "Still feeling poorly?" Every eye turned to Margaret. She forced her expression into something resembling calm. "Just tired," she managed. "I think I'll retire early." "Nonsense," her father said. "You need to rebuild your strength. Eat." It was not a suggestion. Margaret picked up her fork with numb fingers and forced herself to swallow food that tasted like ash. Around her, the conversation continued. Talk of cotton prices and slave rebellions in other counties, speculation about whether the Cherokee would finally be completely driven from Tennessee, jokes about Indian scalps and savage justice. Margaret sat through it all, smiling when expected, nodding at appropriate moments, dying slowly from the inside out. After dinner, she found Bessie in the upstairs hallway. $50, Margaret whispered urgently. "We have to warn him." Bessie's eyes widened. "Warn him how? You can't go into those woods. Your father will have you watched now, and I can't leave without permission. Then we find someone who can." "Miss Margaret, he saved my life, Bessie. I won't let my father's blood money put him in the ground." Something in Margaret's voice must have convinced her, because Bessie's resistance crumbled. "There's a boy in the quarters," she said finally. "Jimmy's son. He knows the woods, knows how to move quiet. He could get a message through." "Tonight," Margaret said. "It has to be tonight." Bessie nodded once, then disappeared down the servants' stair. Margaret returned to her room and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, she could see her father's men taking up positions around the property line, rifles slung over their shoulders, hunting dogs at their heels. The trap was being set. And somewhere in the forest, Nokosi had no idea that the cost of his mercy was about to be collected in full. The boy's name was Samuel, though everyone in the quarters called him Little Sam to distinguish him from his father, Big Sam, who worked the cotton fields. Little Sam was 14 years old and small for his age, with quick hands and quicker feet that made him valuable for tasks requiring stealth. He had learned early that survival meant being invisible, being useful, and knowing when to keep his mouth shut. Bessie found him after midnight, behind the quarters where he was supposed to be sleeping, but was instead carving a piece of wood by moonlight. She pressed a folded piece of paper into his palm, along with specific instructions delivered in a voice that left no room for questions. "Follow the river north until you reach the split oak," she whispered. "Leave this under the stone where the roots are exposed. Don't wait, don't look around. Just leave it and come straight back." Little Sam looked at the paper, then at Bessie's face. He was smart enough to know this was dangerous, and smart enough to know that refusing would be worse. "Yes'm," he said quietly. He slipped into the darkness like water through fingers, moving through the forest with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his childhood learning its secrets. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see by once his eyes adjusted. He knew these woods almost as well as the Cherokee who had lived here first, knew which paths the overseers used, which hollows stayed hidden from patrol routes, which trees marked the boundary between plantation land and the wild places beyond. The split oak was a massive tree that had been struck by lightning years ago, its trunk divided down the middle, but still living, still growing despite the wound. The Cherokee had used it as a marker long before the white settlers arrived, and those who remained still checked it regularly for messages left by those who had gone west, or by those who helped people escape north. Little Sam found the stone and wedged the folded paper underneath it exactly as instructed. He did not read what was written inside, did not need to. Whatever it said was dangerous enough that Miss Margaret herself had written it, and that was all he needed to know. He was halfway back when he heard the dogs. The sound carried through the night air like a promise of violence, the deep baying of bloodhounds that had caught a scent, followed by the shouts of men and the crack of rifles being loaded. Little Sam's heart jumped into his throat. He dropped low and stayed still, barely breathing, every muscle locked in place. Had they seen him? Had someone followed? but the sounds were moving away from him, deeper into the forest, toward the north ridge, where the land rose steep and rocky. They were hunting something, but it was not him. Not yet. Little Sam ran. He made it back to the quarters just as the first grey light touched the eastern sky, his chest heaving, his feet bleeding from thorns he had not felt while running. He found his pallet and lay down, pulling the thin blanket over his trembling body. In the main house, Margaret lay awake in her bed, listening to the same distant sounds of pursuit and wondering if her warning had arrived in time. It had not. Nokosi had been sleeping in a small cave on the north ridge, the same place he had sheltered for the past 2 months since the bounty hunters had driven him from his last camp near the Ocoee River. It was a good location, defensible, hidden behind a waterfall that masked the entrance, with a clear view of anyone approaching from below. But it also had only one exit. He woke to the sound of dogs and knew immediately what it meant. Someone had tracked him here, or more likely, someone had been paid to reveal his location. There were always people willing to sell information for the right price, Cherokee and white alike. Nokosi gathered his few possessions with practiced speed, his rifle, his knife, a leather pouch containing dried meat and medicinal herbs, a blanket roll, everything else he left behind. Material things could be replaced, his life could not. He emerged from the cave and assessed the situation quickly. 3 men coming up the ridge from the south, moving fast but not quietly, emboldened by numbers and daylight. 2 dogs out front, their noses to the ground, their voices raised in the excited baying that meant they were close. Nokosi had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached him. He considered his options. He could not go down. They were coming from that direction. He could not go east. That led deeper into Whitford land, toward the plantation itself. West was possible, but would take him toward the main road where he would be exposed. That left north, up and over the ridge, into the high country where the terrain was roughest and the forest thickest. He started climbing. The dogs reached the cave entrance and went mad, circling and barking and scratching at the stone. The men arrived moments later, breathing hard, rifles ready. "He's here!" one of them shouted. "Fresh tracks, can't be more than minutes ahead." $50 says I get him first," another laughed. They found the cave empty and the trail leading upward, and they followed without hesitation, the scent of money stronger than caution. Nokosi was fast, but the men were motivated and the dogs were relentless. They gained on him as he climbed, the gap closing with every 100 yards. He could hear them now, hear their voices calling to each other, hear the dogs crashing through underbrush. Near the top of the ridge, where the trees thinned and the rock became exposed, Nokosi made a decision. He could not outrun them, so he would have to outthink them. He found a narrow ledge that ran along the face of a limestone cliff, barely 2 feet wide, with a sheer drop of 60 feet to the rocks below. He stepped onto it carefully, moving sideways, his back pressed against the stone. The dogs reached the cliff edge and stopped, whining and pacing, unwilling to follow. The men arrived and saw the ledge and the empty forest beyond. "He went across," one said, peering over the edge. "That's suicide," another argued. "No man crosses that without a rope." "Then where is he?" They stood arguing, while Nokosi waited in the small cave entrance he had found halfway along the ledge, barely large enough for a man to squeeze into, completely invisible, unless you knew it was there. He had discovered it months ago while exploring, had filed the information away, never imagining he would need it so desperately. Eventually, the men decided he must have continued along the ridge and moved on, dragging the reluctant dogs with them. Nokosi waited another hour before emerging, his muscles cramped from holding still, his throat dry with thirst. He made his way down the far side of the ridge as the sun climbed toward noon, moving carefully now, knowing that one mistake could undo his narrow escape. By the time he reached the valley floor, his legs were shaking and his mind was churning with questions. Someone had told them where to find him, someone had sold him out, but who? And why now, after months of successfully avoiding capture? He was so focused on these thoughts that he almost missed the split oak entirely. He had not been planning to check it, had not expected any messages, had no reason to think anyone would try to reach him, but something made him pause. Instinct, perhaps, or fate. He found the paper under the stone and unfolded it with cautious hands. The handwriting was careful and elegant, clearly educated, clearly female. "They are hunting you. My father has offered $50 for your capture or death. Please run. Go far from here. I am sorry. I never meant for my life to cost yours." Nokosi stood holding the paper as the full weight of understanding crashed over him. Margaret Whitford had sent this warning. Margaret, whose leg he had put his mouth on, whose blood he had tasted mixed with venom, whose eyes had looked at him with something he had not dared to name. She had risked everything to warn him, and he had nearly died anyway. He should have felt grateful. He should have felt relief that his narrow escape was now explained. But what he felt instead was something far more dangerous, a connection forged in poison and mercy, strengthened by secrets and sealed with blood. She had saved his life as surely as he had saved hers, and now they were bound by the kind of debt that could never be repaid, only acknowledged. Nokosi burned the paper, grinding the ashes into the dirt until no trace remained. Then he turned north, away from the plantation, away from the ridge, away from Margaret Whitford and the impossible thing growing between them. He walked for 3 days, sleeping rough, eating what he could hunt or gather. He crossed into the high country where even the bounty hunters rarely ventured, where the Cherokee who remained hidden lived in scattered camps connected by trails only they knew. He should have kept going, should have disappeared into the mountains completely, should have found his way to one of the hidden valleys where his people survived in defiant isolation. But on the 4th morning, he turned around and started walking back. Some debts, he realized, were larger than survival. Some connections were stronger than sense, and some things, once started, could not be stopped, only followed to whatever end they demanded. Margaret was not allowed to leave the house. Her father had not made it an explicit order, but it did not need to be. After the failed hunt on the ridge, after the men had returned empty-handed, $50 poorer and considerably more frustrated, Colonel Whitford had tightened security around the plantation. Guards were posted at every entrance, the slaves were watched more carefully, and Margaret found herself constantly accompanied by either her mother or Bessie, with no opportunity to slip away unseen. She spent her days in the parlor, embroidering flowers she would never finish, reading books she could not concentrate on, staring out windows that framed a world she was no longer permitted to enter. The bite mark on her ankle was healing, the scars becoming permanent, 2 small punctures that she found herself touching unconsciously whenever she thought no one was watching. Which was never. Someone was always watching now. At night, she dreamed of the forest, dreamed of Nokosi's hands on her skin, his mouth drawing poison, his voice telling her to go, to say nothing. She woke, tangled in sheets, her heart racing, her body responding to memories that should have terrified her, but instead made her feel more alive than anything in her carefully constructed life ever had. She was going mad, she decided. It was the only explanation for the longing that had taken root inside her, growing like poison ivy, choking out everything else. 2 weeks after the hunt, Judge Blackwell came to dinner again, and this time he brought his son. Robert Blackwell was 24 years old, recently returned from law school in Virginia, and possessed the kind of bland handsomeness that came from good breeding and better nutrition. He had pale blue eyes, sandy hair, and the self-assured manner of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. He was also, Margaret realized with sinking certainty, the real reason for this dinner. "Margaret," her father said after the dessert had been served and the conversation had settled into comfortable patterns, "Robert has expressed interest in calling on you. I've given my permission, of course." It was not a question. It was an announcement. Robert smiled at her from across the table. "I hope that's agreeable to you, Miss Whitford. I've heard you're an accomplished pianist. I'd love to hear you play sometime." Margaret felt the walls closing in. This was how it happened, how futures were decided over roasted duck and brandy, how lives were traded like livestock, how daughters became wives and wives became property. "Of course," she heard herself say, "that would be lovely." The lie tasted worse than venom. After dinner, Robert cornered her in the library while her father and Judge Blackwell discussed cotton futures in the next room. He stood too close, his cologne thick and cloying, his hand reaching for hers with presumptuous familiarity. "Your father and mine have been discussing an arrangement," he said, his voice low and intimate in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. "I think you and I would be well suited. The Blackwell and Whitford plantations together would control nearly 2,000 acres. We'd be the most powerful family in the county." "Is that what you want?" Margaret asked, pulling her hand away. "Power? Of course, don't you?" He seemed genuinely confused by the question. "What else is there?" "Freedom," Margaret thought. "Choice, love, something real." But she said none of these things. Instead, she smiled politely and excused herself, claiming a headache that was not entirely a lie. That night, she found Bessie in her room, turning down the bed. "He's going to marry me off," Margaret said without preamble. "To Robert Blackwell." Bessie's hand stilled on the quilt. "I know, child." "Whole house knows. Your mother's already talking about wedding dates." "I can't," Margaret's voice cracked. "Bessie, I can't marry him. I can't spend the rest of my life pretending to be someone I'm not, loving someone I don't, living a life that feels like slow death. What choice do you have?" It was the question Margaret had been avoiding for 2 weeks. What choice did she have? She was 19 years old, female, and utterly dependent on her father's goodwill. She owned nothing, controlled nothing, had no legal standing to refuse anything he decided, unless she ran. The thought arrived fully formed, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She could run, could disappear into the forest the way Nokosi had, could leave behind everything, the plantation, her family, her name, her future. "I need to see him," Margaret whispered. "I need to talk to him." Bessie closed her eyes. "Oh, child, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that he understood something about me in 5 minutes that no one in this house has understood in 19 years. I'm thinking that he risked his life to save mine, and I can't live the rest of my days wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to find him again." "You're talking about throwing your life away." "No," Margaret's voice was steady now, certain. "I'm talking about claiming it." Bessie looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw something shift in her face, a recognition, perhaps, of a courage she had not expected to find in her mistress. "Little Sam can get a message to him," Bessie said finally. "Can tell him to meet you. But Miss Margaret, you need to understand, once you do this, there's no coming back. Your father will disown you. Your mother will never speak to you again. Everyone you've ever known will consider you dead or worse. I know. And this Cherokee man, you barely know him. He might not want what you're thinking. He might turn you away." "Then at least I'll have asked." Margaret met Bessie's eyes. "At least I'll have tried." Bessie nodded slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow night. There's a new moon. No one will see me leave." "Where?" "The Split Oak." "Where he found the first message." Bessie moved to the door, then paused. "Miss Margaret, what you're feeling, this thing you think is between you, you know it can't end well, don't you? Even if he meets you, even if he feels the same. The world won't allow it." "I know," Margaret said softly. "But maybe some things are worth doing even when they can't end well. Maybe trying is enough." Bessie left, without another word. Margaret lay awake all night, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences, through hopes and terrors. By dawn, she had made her peace with what was coming. She would meet Nokosi one more time, would tell him what she felt, would offer him a choice. And whatever he decided, she would finally be someone who had chosen for herself, even if only once. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret played the piano for Robert's visit, smiled through lunch with her mother's friends, pretended interest in fabric samples for a wedding dress she would never wear. She performed her role flawlessly, all while feeling like she was watching herself from a great distance. When night finally came, she dressed in her plainest clothes, a dark wool dress, sturdy boots, a cloak with a hood. She left behind her jewelry, her fancy dresses, everything that marked her as Colonel Whitford's daughter. She carried only a small bag with bread, cheese, and the silver brush that had belonged to her grandmother, the one thing she could not bear to leave behind. At midnight, she slipped from her room and down the servants' stairs, moving through the dark house with her heart hammering. She knew every creaking board, every door that needed careful handling. She had practiced this escape 100 times in her mind. The back door opened silently. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of coming rain. Margaret pulled the hood over her distinctive dark hair and started walking. She made it to the split oak just as the first drops began to fall, and found Nokosi already waiting in the shadows, his eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the storm clouds gathering overhead. "You came," she breathed. "You called," he said simply. They stood facing each other in the darkness, rain beginning to fall harder now, and Margaret realized she had no idea what to say. How did you tell someone that they had changed everything? That poison and mercy had somehow become the most important moments of your life? "I'm supposed to marry Robert Blackwell," she said finally. "My father has decided. The wedding is in 3 months. Nokosi's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. "I came to tell you that I won't," Margaret continued, her voice stronger now. "I won't marry him. I won't go back to that house. I won't live a life that was chosen for me by people who think I'm property to be traded." "What will you do?" It was the essential question. Margaret took a breath. "Run. Disappear. Find somewhere they can't find me." She paused. "Unless you know a better way." Nokosi was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he would not answer. The rain fell harder, soaking through her cloak, plastering her hair to her face. She started to shiver, though whether from cold or fear she could not tell. Then he spoke, his words careful and deliberate. "There are Cherokee camps in the high mountains, hidden places where those who refused removal still live. I could take you there. You would be safe." Margaret's heart leaped. "And you? Would you stay?" "I have nowhere else to go. The bounty on me makes the lowlands too dangerous." It was not a declaration of love. It was not even a promise. But it was an answer, and Margaret would take it. "When do we leave?" "Now," Nokosi said, "before the rain stops. The storm will cover our tracks, mask our scent. By the time they realize you're gone, we'll be too far to follow." Margaret nodded, suddenly terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. She was doing this. She was actually doing this. Nokosi held out his hand. "Once we start, we don't stop. No matter what you hear behind us, no matter who calls your name, we run until we reach the mountains. Do you understand?" Margaret took his hand. His palm was warm and rough against hers, solid and real in a way nothing else in her life had ever been. "I understand," she said, and they ran. They ran through the rain-soaked forest like ghosts, moving fast and silent through a world gone dark and wild. The storm intensified around them, turning the paths to mud, bending trees and tearing leaves, the thunder so loud it seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Margaret had never been so cold, so wet, so alive. Nokosi led the way with absolute confidence, following trails invisible to Margaret's untrained eyes, navigating by instinct and memory through terrain that all looked the same to her. Endless trees, endless darkness, endless possibility of getting lost forever. But she trusted him, had no choice but to trust him, now that she had committed to this madness. They ran for hours. When Margaret stumbled, Nokosi caught her. When her breath came in ragged gasps, he slowed just enough for her to recover before pushing forward again. He spoke rarely and only when necessary. "Step here. Watch the route. Quiet now. Patrol route ahead." The plantation fell behind them. The river fell behind them. Everything Margaret had ever known fell behind them, until there was nothing ahead but wilderness and nothing behind but consequences. As dawn approached, the rain finally stopped. They had climbed high enough that the air tasted different, thinner, colder, sharp with pine and stone. Margaret's legs trembled with exhaustion, her dress torn and muddy, her expensive boots ruined beyond repair. She had never been so uncomfortable in her life, and some small part of her marveled at how little she cared. Nokosi stopped at the base of a granite cliff face, covered in moss and ferns. To Margaret, it looked like solid stone. But he reached into what appeared to be a thick growth of mountain laurel and pulled back branches that had been carefully arranged to conceal an opening. "Inside," he said, "we rest here until nightfall." The cave was small, but dry, with evidence that someone, probably Nokosi himself, had used it before. There was wood stacked neatly in one corner, a fire ring made of stones, and what looked like a sleeping pallet made from pine boughs and deer hide. Nokosi built a small fire, coaxing flames from damp kindling with practiced efficiency. Margaret collapsed near it, her muscles screaming protest, her mind still reeling from what she had done. She had run away, had left everything behind, had chosen a Cherokee man she barely knew over her entire life. The magnitude of it hit her all at once, and she started to shake. Nokosi noticed. He pulled the deer hide from the pallet and draped it around her shoulders, his movements gentle, his expression unreadable. "Shock," he said simply. "It will pass. You need food, warm clothes, sleep." He rummaged through a leather pack Margaret had not noticed before and produced a shirt made of soft deerskin. "Yours is wet, this will be warmer." Margaret looked down at her soaked dress, at the expensive fabric that had once signaled her status as Colonel Whitford's daughter, and now signaled nothing but poor planning for running away. Nokosi was right. She needed to change, but the thought of undressing in front of him made heat flood her face, despite the cold. "Turn around," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. He did, immediately and without comment, facing the cave entrance, while Margaret struggled out of her wet things and pulled on the deerskin shirt. It fell to mid-thigh, far shorter than any dress she had ever worn, and the soft leather felt strange against her skin, intimate, almost living. "You can look now," she said. Nokosi turned back and paused, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. It was not the leering assessment of Robert Blackwell or the calculating appraisal of her father. It was something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement that she looked more like herself in borrowed Cherokee clothing than she ever had in silk and petticoats. "It suits you," he said quietly. Margaret wrapped the deer hide tighter around her shoulders and sat by the fire, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "What happens now?" "Now we rest. Tonight we continue north. 3 more days to reach the camps if the weather holds, maybe 4, and then—" Nokosi was silent for a moment, feeding small sticks to the fire. "Then you will have to decide who you want to be. The Cherokee who survived removal. We are not your people. We do not live as you have lived. There are no servants, no grand houses, no easy comforts. Everyone works, everyone contributes. If you cannot adapt, you will not survive. I can adapt." "Can you?" He looked at her directly now, his eyes dark and serious in the firelight. "Can you give up everything you have known? Can you accept that you will never see your family again, never attend another ball, never sleep in a soft bed or wear a fancy dress? Can you live as we do, hunting and gathering, moving when we must, hiding from those who would drive us out or kill us?" "Yes," Margaret said, though fear coiled in her stomach. "If the alternative is marrying Robert Blackwell and living a lie for the rest of my life, then yes, I would rather struggle with truth than flourish with falsehood." Nokosi studied her for a long moment. Your father will send men after you. When he realizes you are gone, he will not rest until you are found or until he is certain you are dead. The bounty on me will double, maybe triple. We will be hunted for the rest of our lives. I know. And still you ran. I ran because of you, Margaret said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Because you saw me as a person worth saving, not as property worth owning. Because in the 5 minutes we spent together by that river, I felt more known than I have in 19 years of being Colonel Whitford's daughter. Because... She stopped, suddenly afraid of saying too much. Because? Nokosi prompted, his voice soft. Because when I thought about never seeing you again, it hurt worse than the snake bite, worse than anything. Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes. I know it is foolish. I know we barely know each other. But sometimes knowledge is not the same as truth, and the truth is that I would rather be here in this cave with you than anywhere else in the world. The silence that followed was so complete, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the crackle of the fire and the drip of water somewhere in the cave's depths. Then Nokosi moved closer, close enough that Margaret could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could smell wood smoke and leather and rain on his skin. When I drew the poison from your leg, he said quietly, I tasted your blood. In my culture, that creates a bond, a responsibility. I became connected to you in a way that cannot be undone. I told myself it meant nothing beyond obligation, that once I delivered you safely home, the debt was paid. And now? Now I know I was lying to myself. His hand reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. You are brave and reckless and completely unprepared for the life you have chosen. You will slow me down, put me in greater danger, complicate everything. Margaret's heart sank. Then why did you agree to take me? Because I could not leave you to that fate. Because I have been alone for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Because, he paused, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Because sometimes knowledge is not the same as truth, and the truth is that from the moment I saw you by that river, something changed in me that I do not fully understand. Margaret leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Is this forbidden? In your culture, I mean, a Cherokee man and a white woman. Everything about our situation is forbidden, Nokosi said, by your laws and sometimes by mine. But my people also believe that some connections are chosen by forces greater than us, that the spirits sometimes bind two lives together for reasons we cannot see. Do you believe that? I am beginning to. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture so intimate it made Margaret's breath stop. They stayed like that for a long moment, not kissing but connected, sharing warmth and breath and the weight of choices that could not be unmade. Sleep now, Nokosi finally said, pulling back. You will need your strength for the journey ahead. He moved to the cave entrance, clearly intending to keep watch while she rested. Margaret wanted to call him back, wanted to ask him to stay close, but exhaustion dragged her down before she could form the words. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, her body finally surrendering to the toll of the night's flight. When she woke, it was late afternoon, and Nokosi was gone. Panic seized her immediately. Had he left her? Had he decided she was too much trouble after all? Had bounty hunters found the cave? Then she heard movement outside, careful footsteps, the rustle of someone approaching. Margaret grabbed the knife Nokosi had left near the fire, her hands shaking. Nokosi appeared in the entrance, carrying 2 dead rabbits and what looked like wild mushrooms wrapped in large leaves. He saw the knife in her hand and smiled slightly. Good, you have instinct for danger. That will serve you in the mountains. Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely she almost dropped the knife. I thought you had left. Without telling you? Without taking my pack? He gestured to the leather bag still sitting in the corner. I went to hunt and gather. We cannot run on empty stomachs. He showed her how to prepare the rabbits, how to clean them efficiently and cook them over the fire. Margaret had never skinned an animal before, had never even considered where her food came from before it appeared on silver platters. Her hands shook at first, but Nokosi guided her patiently, showing her the proper cuts, explaining which parts were edible and which were not. "In the camps," he said as they worked, "everyone must know these skills. There is no one to do it for you. Can you learn?" "I will learn," Margaret said firmly, ignoring her queasy stomach. "Whatever I need to know, I will learn it." They ate in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside the cave. The rabbit was tough and gamey, nothing like the tender meats Margaret was accustomed to, but it was food, and it was warm, and she was grateful for it. After they finished, Nokosi banked the fire carefully, making sure no smoke would give away their position. Then he sat beside Margaret, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Tell me about the camps," Margaret said. "Tell me what to expect." So he did. He told her about the small communities of Cherokee who had refused removal, who had hidden in the high mountains and survived through determination and knowledge of the land. He told her about the families who had lost everything but still held together, about the elders who preserved their language and stories, about the children who grew up knowing they were hunted simply for existing. He told her about the women who would be suspicious of her at first, who would test her to see if she was truly willing to work or just a white woman playing at poverty. He told her about the prejudice she would face, the whispers, the doubts. "It will not be easy," he said. "Some will never accept you. Some will always see you as the enemy, as the daughter of those who drove us from our lands. You will have to prove yourself every day." "I understand," Margaret said. "I would not accept me either, if I were them." Nokosi turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You are wiser than I expected." "I am not wise," Margaret said. "I am just honest enough to know that I come from a world built on the suffering of others. That my comfort was purchased with your people's displacement and the enslavement of others. I cannot undo that, but I can refuse to perpetuate it." "That is a beginning," Nokosi said softly. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire's embers glow in the darkness. Outside, night sounds filled the forest, owls hunting, small creatures rustling through leaves, the wind moving through the high branches. "Nokosi," Margaret said finally, "why were you exiled from your tribe?" His body tensed beside her. For a moment she thought he would not answer, that she had pushed too far, asked for secrets he was not ready to share. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy with old pain. 3 years ago, before the removal, I helped a group of slaves escape from a plantation near Chattanooga. They came through our lands in the night, desperate and starving, and I gave them food and shelter and showed them the path north toward freedom. "That is not a crime," Margaret said. "That is mercy." "My people thought differently. We were already under pressure from white settlers, already fighting to keep our lands. The tribe elders said that helping runaway slaves would bring down wrath from the slaveholders, would give them more reason to drive us out. They said I had endangered everyone for the sake of strangers. So they exiled you. They gave me a choice. Stop helping or leave. I could not stop. So I left." Nokosi's voice was steady, but Margaret heard the grief beneath it. "I have been alone since then, moving from place to place, helping when I can, hunted by bounty hunters and rejected by my own people." Margaret reached for his hand in the darkness, lacing her fingers through his. "You are not alone anymore." He looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "No," he agreed quietly. "I am not alone anymore." That night they slept side by side on the pallet, Margaret wrapped in the deer hide, and Nokosi's presence a warm, solid reality beside her. It was not romantic or sensual. They were too exhausted, too aware of the danger still surrounding them. But it was intimate in ways Margaret had never experienced, a closeness that had nothing to do with propriety or expectation and everything to do with chosen trust. She woke once in the deep night to find Nokosi's arm draped protectively over her, his breathing deep and even. In sleep, the hardness left his face, and she could see traces of the young man he must have been before exile, before loss, before survival became his only goal. Margaret fell back asleep, thinking that whatever happened in the days ahead, she would not regret this choice. Could not regret choosing truth over comfort, freedom over security, this man over the life that had been mapped out for her since birth. When dawn came, they prepared to move again. 3 more days, Nokosi said, checking their supplies. Maybe less if we push hard. Then let us push hard, Margaret said, surprising herself with her own determination. The sooner we reach safety, the sooner we can stop running. Nokosi smiled at that, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face completely. You are going to be trouble in the camps. The elders will not know what to do with you. Good, Margaret said, returning his smile. I have spent 19 years being exactly what people expected. I think it is time I became trouble instead. They left the cave as the sun rose over the mountains, 2 figures moving north through ancient forests, toward hidden communities and uncertain welcome, toward a future that belonged to them alone. Behind them, at the Whitford plantation, Margaret's absence had been discovered. Her father's rage shook the house like an earthquake, his voice carrying across the grounds as he ordered men saddled, dogs leashed, every available hand mobilized for the hunt. "Find her!" he roared. "Find her and bring her back, and if you find that Cherokee savage with her, kill him on sight." The pursuit had begun, but Margaret and Nokosi had a day's head start, a storm-washed trail, and the kind of desperate determination that made people capable of impossible things. They ran. By the 3rd day, Margaret understood what Nokosi had meant about struggle and survival. Every muscle in her body screamed protest. Her feet, despite the sturdy boots, had developed blisters that burst and bled and formed again. The deerskin shirt that had seemed so comfortable in the cave now chafed against sunburned shoulders. She was hungry in a way she had never experienced, not the polite appetite that came before scheduled meals, but a gnawing, constant emptiness that made her lightheaded and desperate. And still they pushed north, climbing higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and cold, where the trees changed from oak and hickory to pine and hemlock, where the world seemed to narrow to nothing but the next step, the next breath, the next moment of not giving up. Nokosi set a brutal pace, driven by necessity and the knowledge that hunters were behind them. They could not see their pursuers, could not hear them, but both knew they were coming. Colonel Whitford was not a man who accepted defiance, and his daughter's flight with a Cherokee man would be seen as the ultimate betrayal, not just of family but of race, class, and the entire social order that gave him power. They traveled mostly at night now, sleeping in brief snatches during daylight hours in whatever shelter they could find. Hollow logs, dense thickets of rhododendron, shallow caves that offered minimal protection. Nokosi taught Margaret to move silently, to step on rocks rather than leaves, to break no branches, to leave no trace of their passage. She learned to identify edible plants, ramps and fiddlehead ferns, wild onions and watercress. She learned to drink from streams by lying flat and sipping directly from the current, because they had no vessel for carrying water. She learned to ignore discomfort, to push through exhaustion, to find reserves of strength she had not known existed. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as they rested in a grove of ancient hemlocks, Margaret finally broke. "I cannot," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "Nokosi, I cannot go any further." He had been scouting ahead, but returned immediately when he heard her voice. He found her sitting with her back against a massive tree trunk, tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking. "My feet," she whispered. "I think they are infected. I can feel fever starting. We need to stop." "Just for a day, please." Nokosi knelt and carefully removed her boots. What he found made his jaw tighten. The blisters had indeed become infected, the skin red and swollen, oozing fluid that smelled wrong. If left untreated, the infection could spread, could kill her as surely as any bounty hunter. He had pushed her too hard. In his desperation to reach safety, he had forgotten that she was not raised to this life, that her body was not conditioned for this kind of sustained hardship. "We stop," he said decisively, "but not here. There's a place nearby, a cabin that belonged to a Cherokee family before removal. Abandoned now, but it has walls and a roof. We can rest there for a day while I treat your feet." "Can you carry me?" Margaret asked, shame coloring her voice. "I do not think I can walk." Without answering, Nokosi lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest. Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in his scent, pine sap and wood smoke, and the sharp tang of exertion. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am slowing you down. You should leave me and save yourself." "No!" The word was absolute, leaving no room for argument. "We survive together, or not at all." The cabin appeared after another mile of walking, so overgrown with vines and brambles that it was nearly invisible. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and the door hung askew on leather hinges, but it was shelter, actual walls, and a place to make fire without fear of the smoke being seen. Nokosi kicked aside debris and laid Margaret on a relatively clean patch of floor. Then he went to work with the focused intensity she had come to recognize as his way of dealing with crisis. He built a small fire in the stone hearth, coaxing it to life with the last of their dry tinder. He gathered fresh pine boughs to make a sleeping platform. He disappeared outside and returned with an armload of plants Margaret did not recognize. Broad leaves, thick roots, clusters of tiny white flowers. "This is golden seal," he explained, crushing the roots into a paste. "It fights infection. This is plantain leaf. It draws out poison. And this is yarrow for pain." He worked the mixture into a poultice, his hands gentle as he applied it to Margaret's ravaged feet. She hissed at the sting, but did not pull away. When he finished, he wrapped her feet in clean strips torn from his spare shirt, then elevated them on the pine boughs. "Rest now," he ordered. "I will keep watch." But Margaret could see exhaustion in every line of his body, could see how his hands trembled slightly as he built up the fire. He had been carrying her for the last mile, had been navigating and hunting and protecting them both for 3 solid days with almost no sleep. "Nokosi," she said softly, "when did you last sleep?" "I will sleep when we reach the camps." "That is not an answer. Come here." When he did not move, she added with surprising firmness, "Please. I cannot rest if I know you are driving yourself to collapse." He hesitated, then moved to sit beside her on the pine boughs. Margaret shifted over despite the pain in her feet, making room, and after a moment Nokosi lay down beside her, his body tense with the effort of staying alert. "Close your eyes," Margaret said. "I will keep first watch. You cannot even walk, but I can see, and I can wake you if anything approaches." She touched his face gently, turning his head toward her. "Trust me to protect you the way you have protected me." Nokosi stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. A surrender, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that their survival had become mutual, that he could not carry the entire burden alone. 2 hours, he said finally. "Wake me in 2 hours." He was asleep within minutes, his breathing evening out, his body finally releasing the tension it had held for days. Margaret watched him sleep, this man who had saved her life twice now, once from Venom and once from a future that would have destroyed her slowly. She thought about her father, probably organizing search parties at this very moment. She thought about her mother, crying into her handkerchief and asking what they had done wrong. She thought about Robert Blackwell, his pride wounded by her rejection, possibly even joining the hunt. She should feel guilt, should feel regret, should mourn the relationship she had destroyed and the life she had abandoned. But all she felt was a fierce, burning certainty that she had made the right choice. Outside, shadows lengthened as afternoon turned to evening. Margaret kept watch as promised, her eyes scanning the forest for movement, her ears alert for sounds that did not belong. Her feet throbbed despite the poultice. Her body ached in ways she had not known were possible, and she was hungrier than she had ever been. And yet she was happy, genuinely, inexplicably happy. It made no sense. She was running for her life, infected and injured, hiding in an abandoned cabin with a man who was hunted simply for existing. By any rational measure, she should be terrified and miserable. But she was free, for the first time in her life, truly free. That freedom had a price. Comfort, security, family, social standing, everything she had been raised to value. But what she had gained in return was something her old life could never have given her: the ability to choose her own path, to act according to her own conscience, to love whom she wanted without permission or constraint. Because she did love him. Margaret acknowledged it to herself as she watched Nokosi sleep, his face peaceful in the firelight. She loved this man who had risked everything to help her, who had shown her kindness when he had every reason to show her hostility, who had chosen truth over safety again and again until it had cost him his home, his family, his place in the world. She loved him with an intensity that frightened her, loved him in ways that her upbringing had never prepared her for. Not the romantic fantasies she had read about in books, but something rawer and more real, forged in adversity and sealed with shared survival. 2 hours passed. Margaret did not wake him. 3 hours. 4. The sun set and darkness filled the cabin, broken only by firelight that painted dancing shadows on the walls. Still, Margaret kept watch, letting Nokosi sleep, knowing he needed rest more than she needed relief. It was near midnight when he finally woke on his own, sitting up abruptly with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. "You let me sleep too long," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only wonder. As if the gift of rest was something he had forgotten existed. "You needed it." He turned to look at her, really look at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. There was desire there, yes, but also tenderness, also gratitude, also something that looked very much like love. "Margaret," he said quietly, "do you understand what we are to each other now? Tell me. In my culture, when two people choose to survive together, when they share food and shelter and protection, when they trust each other with their lives," he paused, searching for words, "they become family, not by blood, but by choice. It is a bond as strong as marriage, sometimes stronger." Is that what we are, family?" "I think we are more than that." Nokosi moved closer, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I think we are what happens when two people who were supposed to be enemies discover they are really the same. Two souls who refuse to accept the world as it is, who would rather struggle together than surrender separately." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "I love you," she said simply, because anything else would have been a lie. "I know it is too soon and too complicated, and possibly completely insane, but I love you." Nokosi's hand tightened on hers. "In my language, we have a word, ageha. It means my heart, not just the organ that beats in your chest, but the essence of who you are, the part that feels and hopes and dares to love despite all the reasons not to." He brought her hand to his chest, pressing it against his heart. "You are Ageha to me. You have become necessary." Margaret leaned forward and kissed him, finally closing the distance that had existed between them since the river. It was not her first kiss. Robert Blackwell had stolen that at a Christmas party the previous year, a wet and clumsy thing that had made her feel nothing except relief when it ended. This was entirely different. Nokosi's lips were soft but insistent, tasting of wood smoke and wild herbs and something indefinably him. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers threading through her tangled hair. The kiss deepened, hunger and tenderness mixing in equal measure, both of them pouring into it all the words they did not know how to say. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nokosi pressed his forehead to hers. In that gesture, Margaret now understood, was his way of expressing connection deeper than words. "When we reach the camps," he said quietly, "I will ask the elders' permission to make you my wife according to our customs. It will not be recognized by white law, will mean nothing to the world outside, but it will bind us in the eyes of my people and in the eyes of the spirits." "Yes," Margaret breathed. "Yes." They held each other through the night, sometimes talking quietly, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, sometimes kissing with the urgency of people who knew their time might be limited. Margaret's feet still throbbed, but she barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to this moment, this cabin, this man who had become her entire future. When dawn came, Nokosi checked her feet and declared the infection reduced enough to travel. "One more day," he said, "maybe less. The camps are close now. I can feel it." They left the cabin as the sun rose, Margaret leaning on Nokosi for support, both of them moving slower than before, but moving together. The forest around them had changed. The trees were different here, older and taller, and the undergrowth was thick with rhododendron that formed natural walls along the trail. "This is Cherokee land," Nokosi explained. "Land that was always ours. Land they could not take because it is too high, too remote, too difficult to farm. Land that remembers us." As if in response to his words, Margaret heard something that made her stop. Voices, distant but distinct, speaking in a language she did not understand. Cherokee, she realized. Actual Cherokee voices, not hidden or fleeing but present and alive. Nokosi smiled. "We have arrived." He led her off the trail and up a steep incline, through a gap in the rhododendron that revealed a hidden valley. And there, spread across the valley floor, was something Margaret had never expected to see, a living community. There were perhaps 30 structures scattered among the trees, a mixture of traditional Cherokee log cabins and temporary shelters made from bark and hide. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near a stream. Women worked together, grinding corn and preparing hides. Men returned from hunting, carrying game. It looked peaceful, normal, a place where life continued despite everything that had tried to destroy it. But as Nokosi led Margaret into the valley, that peace shattered. A woman saw them first and called out in Cherokee, her voice sharp with alarm. Others turned to look. The children stopped playing. Within moments, a group of men had formed, and they were not welcoming. They surrounded Nokosi and Margaret, speaking rapidly in Cherokee, their voices angry and accusatory. Margaret could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. They were not happy to see Nokosi, and they were especially not happy to see a white woman with him. One man stepped forward, older than the others, his face weathered and hard. He spoke directly to Nokosi, his voice low and dangerous. Nokosi responded in Cherokee, his tone respectful but firm. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, while Margaret stood silent, aware that she was the problem, that her presence here was the cause of their anger. Finally, the old man switched to English, probably for Margaret's benefit. "You were exiled, Nokosi. You have no right to return, and you bring our enemy into our home, the daughter of Colonel Whitford, the man who drove our families from their lands." "She is not our enemy," Nokosi said quietly. "She has rejected her father, rejected everything she was raised to be. She has chosen us. She has chosen you, perhaps. That does not make her one of us. Then let her prove herself. Give her the chance to show that her choice was real." The old man studied Margaret for a long moment, his eyes hard and measuring. "You understand that if you stay here, you can never leave, that you will be hunted by your own people for the rest of your life, that you will be Cherokee by choice but white by blood, and both sides will reject you." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I understand. And still you wish to stay." "I wish to build a life where my worth is measured by my actions, not my birth. Where love is not a crime and freedom is not a fantasy. If that life is here, then yes, I wish to stay." Something flickered in the old man's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. He turned back to Nokosi. "She may stay on trial. If she works hard, learns our ways, proves herself useful, then perhaps in time we will accept her. But if she fails, if she proves to be a burden or a danger, she leaves. And you leave with her, Nokosi. Your exile stands." It was not a warm welcome. It was barely a welcome at all. But it was a chance. "Thank you, Elder," Nokosi said, bowing his head slightly. The group dispersed slowly, though many continued to watch them with suspicious eyes. An older woman approached, the same one who had first called out, and spoke briefly to Nokosi in Cherokee before turning to Margaret. "You will stay in my cabin," she said in accented English. "I will teach you. If you can learn, you live. If you cannot, you go." She looked Margaret up and down critically. "You are too soft, too weak, but we will see." And with that, Margaret's new life began. The first week nearly killed her. Margaret had thought she understood hardship after the 3-day flight through the mountains. She had thought her blistered feet and constant hunger had prepared her for the difficult life ahead. She had been wrong. The woman who had taken her in was named Aita, and she had the kind of no-nonsense sternness that came from losing everything and choosing to survive anyway. She was perhaps 50 years old, her face lined with suffering and determination in equal measure. She had lost her husband and 2 sons during the removal, had hidden in these mountains with her daughter and granddaughter, and had rebuilt a life from nothing through sheer force of will. She expected the same from Margaret. "In Cherokee home," Aita explained on that first morning, "everyone works. No slaves, no servants. You want to eat, you prepare food. You want clothes, you make them. You want shelter, you maintain it. You understand?" "I understand," Margaret said. "Understanding and doing are different things. We see which one you have." Aita put Margaret to work immediately. The first task was grinding corn, taking dried kernels and using a mortar and pestle to create meal fine enough for cooking. It looked simple. It was not. Margaret's arms ached within minutes. Her shoulders burned. Her hands blistered from gripping the heavy pestle. And when she finally produced a small amount of meal after an hour of grinding, Aita examined it and shook her head. Too coarse. Grind more. So Margaret ground more, her entire body screaming protest, sweat dripping down her face despite the cool mountain air. When she finished, Aita checked again and nodded slightly. Not approval, but acknowledgement that the work met minimum standards. "Good. Now we make bread." Making bread meant mixing the cornmeal with water and ash to create a thick paste, forming it into cakes and cooking them on hot stones beside the fire. Margaret had never cooked anything in her life, had never even entered the plantation kitchen except to give orders to slaves who did the actual work. Her first attempts were disasters. The cakes fell apart. They burned on one side and stayed raw on the other. They tasted like sadness and regret. Aita ate them anyway, her expression unchanging. "Better tomorrow," was all she said. After bread came water collection, carrying heavy clay jars down to the stream and back up the steep hillside to the cabin. Margaret made 3 trips, her arms trembling, her feet still healing, screaming with each step. After water came firewood collection. After firewood came hide scraping, using a sharp bone tool to remove fat and tissue from deer hides, preparing them to be made into clothing. By the time evening came, Margaret could barely move. Her hands were raw and bleeding. Her body was one continuous ache. She collapsed on the sleeping pallet Aita had provided and nearly wept from exhaustion. "You did not die," Aita observed. "That is good. Tomorrow will be harder." She was right. Each day brought new tasks, new skills to learn, new ways for Margaret to fail and have to try again. She learned to identify edible plants and distinguish them from poisonous ones. She learned to prepare deer hides, grind corn, cook food that would not immediately cause illness. She learned to carry water without spilling it, to build fires that would not smoke, to mend clothing with bone needles and sinew thread. Everything she had known about being useful turned out to be worthless here. Her piano playing meant nothing when corn needed grinding. Her French meant nothing when hides needed scraping. Her embroidery skills meant nothing when real sewing was required to keep clothes intact. She was starting from nothing, learning to be useful in ways her entire life had trained her to avoid. And the physical labor was only part of the challenge. The other Cherokee women watched her constantly, their expressions ranging from suspicious to openly hostile. When Margaret struggled with a task, they did not help. They whispered to each other in Cherokee and smiled in ways that made clear they expected her to fail. When she succeeded, they found new tasks, harder ones, and watched to see how quickly she would break. Margaret understood. She was the enemy by birth, a symbol of everything they had lost. Her father's name was known here, Colonel Whitford, who had purchased Cherokee land seized by the government, who had built his plantation on their displacement. Her presence was a reminder of that loss, and her suffering was probably satisfying to some. She could not blame them, would not have blamed them even if she could. So she worked, and when the work was done, she worked more. And when women spoke to her harshly, or gave her the worst tasks, or accidentally spilled water she had spent an hour carrying, she said nothing and started again. She would prove herself through persistence, through absolute refusal to give up. Nokosi she saw rarely. He was kept separate, housed with the unmarried men, forbidden from spending time with her until the elders decided whether she would be allowed to stay. When their paths crossed, at the stream or during communal meals, he would meet her eyes and offer a small nod of encouragement. It was enough. It had to be enough. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Margaret's hands developed calluses. Her muscles adapted to the constant labor. Her feet healed completely, leaving only the 2 small scars from the snake bite. A reminder of how this had all started. She learned to understand some Cherokee words, picking up the language through constant exposure. She learned the rhythms of communal life, the unspoken rules that governed behavior, the ways that people who had lost everything still managed to maintain dignity and culture. And slowly, grudgingly, some of the women began to soften toward her. It started with small things. A woman named Salali showed Margaret a better way to grind corn. Another, whose name Margaret learned was Tayanita, corrected her hide-scraping technique with less harshness. Aita herself began offering occasional words that approached approval. Better, or yes, like that, or even once, good work. One evening, as Margaret sat by the fire mending a tear in Aita's dress, the old woman spoke. "You have surprised me," she said quietly. Margaret looked up. "How?" "I thought you would leave after 3 days. Thought you would cry and complain and give up. Thought you would be like all white women, soft and useless." Aita paused, studying Margaret in the firelight. "But you stay. You work hard. You do not complain even when given worse tasks. You do not quit." "I cannot quit," Margaret said simply. "There is nowhere for me to go except forward." "That is true for all of us here," Aita replied. "We cannot go back to what was, can only go forward to what might be. You understand this, maybe. That is why you survive." It was the closest thing to acceptance Margaret had received, and it warmed her more than the fire ever could. The next day, Salali approached Margaret while she was washing clothes in the stream. "Tonight," she said in halting English, "we have gathering. All women come. You come too." Margaret looked up in surprise. "Are you certain? I do not want to intrude. Elder says you have earned place. You come." That evening, Margaret joined the women in a large cabin at the center of the community. There were perhaps 20 women present, ranging from teenage girls to elders in their 70s. They sat in a circle, some working on crafts, some simply talking, all speaking Cherokee in the rapid, comfortable way of people among friends. Margaret sat quietly, not understanding most of what was said, but feeling honored to be included. Ayita sat beside her, occasionally translating key points. The conversation covered everything: concerns about food stores for winter, gossip about various community members, discussions of children's education, memories of the old days before removal. There was laughter and tears, arguments and consensus, the full spectrum of human interaction. At one point, an elder woman Margaret did not know turned to her and spoke in Cherokee. Ayita translated. She asks why you chose to come here, to live among us. Margaret considered her answer carefully. Tell her that I was dying slowly in my old life, that the world I came from demanded I be someone I was not, demanded I participate in systems I could not defend. Tell her that Nokosi showed me another way, a way to live with honesty and purpose. Tell her I chose this life because it is hard but true, and I would rather struggle with truth than live comfortably with lies. Ayita translated, and the room fell silent. The women looked at each other, something passing between them that Margaret could not quite read. Then the elder spoke again, longer this time, her voice carrying weight and authority. Ayita translated as she spoke. She says that all of us here have made similar choice. We chose to hide rather than walk the trail of tears, chose hardship over forced removal, chose to live as Cherokee even when they tried to make us disappear. She says maybe you understand us better than we thought. The elder reached out and placed her hand on Margaret's head, a gesture that felt like blessing, like acceptance, like acknowledgement that she belonged. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She had cried enough. Now was time for gratitude. Thank you, she said in Cherokee, one of the few phrases she had learned. Wado. The women smiled. And for the first time since arriving, Margaret felt like she might actually survive here, might actually build a life. After the gathering ended, as Margaret walked back to Ayita's cabin in the darkness, she found Nokosi waiting outside. I heard about tonight, he said quietly. The women's acceptance is most important. If they approve of you, the men will follow. Do the men still object? Some, but less than before. They see you work hard, see you do not complain, see you respect our ways. Nokosi stepped closer, his hand finding hers in the darkness. The elders will make their decision soon. Whether to allow you to stay permanently, whether to allow us to marry, Margaret's heart raced. And if they say no, then we leave together and find another way. But I do not think they will say no. You have proven yourself, Margaret. You have shown them who you really are. I am still learning who I really am, Margaret admitted. Everything I thought I knew about myself turned out to be wrong. I am not the woman who lived in that plantation house. But I am not fully the woman who lives here either. I am somewhere in between. That is where most of us live, Nokosi said gently. Between worlds, between cultures, between what was and what might be. It is not a bad place to be. It is just an honest one. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the darkness, holding each other with the fierce tenderness of people who understood how fragile their happiness was, how easily it could be destroyed. I love you, Margaret whispered against his chest. Ageha, he responded, the Cherokee word for my heart. You are Ageha. They stayed like that until Ayita called from inside the cabin that it was time to sleep. Nokosi kissed Margaret's forehead and disappeared into the night, and Margaret went inside, feeling more at peace than she had since leaving the plantation. 2 days later, the elders called a community gathering. Everyone assembled in the open space at the valley's center, men, women, children, the entire community of survivors who had chosen these mountains over removal. The elder who had first challenged Margaret's presence stood at the center, his face grave and ceremonial. He spoke in Cherokee, his voice carrying across the valley. Ayita stood beside Margaret, translating in whispers. He says, the community has observed the white woman who came with Nokosi. He says she has worked hard, learned quickly, shown respect for our ways. He says the women have spoken on her behalf. He says—" Aita paused, emotion thick in her voice. "He says she may stay." Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely she swayed on her feet. Nokosi, standing with the other men, caught her eye and smiled, a smile of pure joy that transformed his usually serious face. But the elder was not finished speaking. He says that Nokosi's exile is also lifted, that he may return to the community fully, that his crime of helping slaves escape was not really crime at all, but honor, that they were wrong to exile him. Nokosi's expression shifted to shock, then to something that looked very much like grief, the kind of grief that comes from finally being welcomed home after years of wandering. The elder continued, and Aita translated, "He says that if Nokosi and Margaret wish to marry, according to our customs, the community will witness and bless their union. He says that love which survives such hardship deserves to be honored." Margaret could not stop the tears now. They spilled down her face freely as she looked at Nokosi across the gathering space, as she saw her entire future opening before her. Difficult, uncertain, but hers. The community erupted in voices, some celebrating, some still skeptical, but most accepting the elder's decision with the kind of pragmatic grace that came from having survived worse things than one white woman joining their ranks. Nokosi crossed the space in 3 strides and pulled Margaret into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around with uncharacteristic exuberance. When he set her down, he was laughing and crying at the same time. "We can stay," he said, as if he still could not quite believe it. "We can build a life here, together." "When?" Margaret asked. "When can we marry?" "Tonight, if you wish. Our ceremonies are simple but meaningful. We speak our intentions before the community and the spirits. We exchange gifts. We promise to support and honor each other. That is all. That is everything," Margaret corrected. "Tonight, then. Let us not wait." That evening, as the sun set over the hidden valley, as the community gathered around a central fire, Margaret Whitford and Nokosi spoke their vows. There was no preacher, no written ceremony, no legal document that would be recognized by the world outside. But there were witnesses, dozens of them, standing in a circle around the fire. There were elders who blessed the union in Cherokee, asking the spirits to protect and guide them. There were women who had accepted Margaret, standing with pride for one of their own. Margaret wore a dress Aita had made for her, simple deerskin decorated with beadwork, more beautiful than anything she had worn in her old life. Nokosi wore traditional Cherokee clothing, his long hair decorated with feathers and leather. They stood facing each other, hands clasped, and spoke the words that bound them. "I choose you," Margaret said in halting Cherokee, the words Aita had taught her. "In this life and beyond, I promise to work beside you, to learn from you, to honor your people as my people. I promise to be worthy of the gift you have given me, the gift of freedom." Nokosi responded in Cherokee, then translated for Margaret. "I choose you. In this life and beyond, I promise to protect you, to teach you, to see you as you truly are, and not as others expect you to be. I promise to build with you a life based on truth, no matter how difficult." They exchanged gifts. Margaret gave Nokosi the silver brush that had belonged to her grandmother, the only thing of value she had brought from her old life. Nokosi gave Margaret a knife he had made himself, its handle carved with symbols that represented protection and partnership. The elder pronounced them married in the eyes of the community and the spirits. The gathering erupted in celebration, singing and dancing and food that had been prepared for the occasion. Margaret and Nokosi danced together in the firelight, surrounded by people who had accepted them, despite all the reasons not to. And for the first time in her life, Margaret felt completely at home. Later, as the celebration wound down and people began returning to their cabins, Aita approached Margaret. "You have done well," she said simply. "Better than I expected. You are Cherokee now, if you choose to be, not by blood but by courage. That is worth more." "Thank you," Margaret said, embracing the older woman, "for everything, for teaching me, for accepting me, for giving me a chance when I deserved none." Aita patted her back awkwardly, clearly unused to such displays of affection. "You earned it. Now go with your husband, build good life, make me proud." Nokosi led Margaret to a small cabin at the edge of the community. Their cabin, built while she had been learning and working, a gift from the community to acknowledge their marriage. It was simple. One room, a sleeping platform, a fire ring, shelves for storing food and tools. It had none of the luxuries Margaret had grown up with. But it was theirs, built by their own hands and the helping hands of neighbors, and that made it more valuable than the Whitford plantation with all its finery. That night, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness born of long anticipation and genuine love. There was no shame, no guilt, no sense of transgression, only two people finally allowed to fully express what they felt for each other. Afterward, lying together on their sleeping platform, Nokosi traced the small scars on Margaret's ankle, the two puncture marks where the rattlesnake had struck all those weeks ago. "These scars saved us," he said quietly. "If that snake had not bitten you, if I had not been nearby, if you had not been brave enough to run—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Everything would be different. The venom saved me," Margaret agreed, "but love killed who I was before, killed the woman I was supposed to become, and I am grateful for it." "Do you ever regret leaving?" Nokosi asked. "Do you miss your old life?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Did she miss comfort? Sometimes. Did she miss her mother? Yes. Did she miss the security of knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring? "No," she said finally, "I do not regret it. I miss some things. My mother's laugh, the smell of my grandmother's roses, the sound of rain on the plantation house roof. But I do not miss the life itself. I do not miss being property dressed up as privilege. I do not miss the lies. And if your father finds us, if bounty hunters track us here, then we run again," Margaret said simply. "Together. That is what matters. Not safety or comfort or security, but choosing each other every day, no matter what comes." Nokosi pulled her closer, his lips against her hair. "Ageha," he murmured. "My heart." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two people who had found home not in a place, but in each other. The weeks turned to months. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn into winter. Margaret's hands grew rough with work, her body strong with labor. She learned to speak Cherokee with increasing fluency, learned the stories and songs and prayers that connected this community to their past. She learned that survival was not just endurance but creativity, finding joy in small things, creating beauty from limited resources, maintaining culture in the face of those who wanted it destroyed. She learned that freedom always carried risk, that choosing your own path meant accepting all the consequences, both good and terrible. And in the spring, she learned she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts terror and joy. Bringing a child into this precarious existence seemed almost cruel. The community was constantly at risk, food was never certain, the threat of discovery hung over everything. But when she told Nokosi, he wept with happiness. "A child," he said, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child, Cherokee and white, born free, belonging to both worlds and bound by neither. They will be proof that love is stronger than hate, that people can choose to be better than the systems they were born into." The community celebrated the news. Aita fussed over Margaret, making sure she ate enough, rested enough, prepared properly. The other women offered advice and assistance, treating the pregnancy as communal responsibility. And in the quiet moments, Margaret would sit with her hand on her growing belly and think about her father, still searching for her. About her mother, probably grieving her as dead. About the life she might have lived as Mrs. Robert Blackwell, suffocating in silk dresses and social expectations. She did not regret her choice, not even for a moment. One late summer evening, as Margaret sat outside the cabin watching Nokosi teach some of the community's children how to track deer, a young boy approached her nervously. "Elder says come quick," the boy said in Cherokee. "White men at valley entrance." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She found Nokosi immediately, and together they ran to where the elders were gathered. A group of 5 white men stood at the narrow entrance to the valley, heavily armed, clearly hunters. They had not yet entered, were being blocked by Cherokee men who had taken defensive positions. Margaret's father was not among them, but she recognized the man in front, James Wheeler, her father's head overseer, known for his cruelty and his skill at tracking runaway slaves. "We're looking for a white woman," Wheeler called out. "Margaret Whitford, daughter of Colonel Benjamin Whitford. We have reason to believe she's being held here against her will." The elder who had accepted Margaret stepped forward. "No one is held here. All who live in Valley choose to be here." "Then you won't mind if we look around," Wheeler said, his hand moving toward his rifle. "We mind very much," the elder replied calmly. "This is our land. You are not welcome here." A tense standoff developed. The Cherokee men were outnumbered but had the advantage of position. The white men were better armed but unfamiliar with the terrain. A fight could go either way and would probably result in deaths on both sides. Margaret made her decision. She stepped forward before Nokosi could stop her, walking past the Cherokee defensive line until she stood in full view of Wheeler and his men. "I am Margaret Whitford," she said clearly, "and I am not being held against my will." Wheeler's eyes widened. "Miss Whitford, good Lord, what have they done to you?" Margaret looked down at herself, at her deerskin dress and calloused hands, at her sun-darkened skin and her hair braided in Cherokee style. She knew what Wheeler saw, a white woman gone native, transformed beyond recognition. "They have done nothing to me," she said firmly. "I chose to come here. I chose to stay. I have made a life here. I am married. I am carrying a child. I am happy." "Your father," Wheeler started. "My father does not control me anymore," Margaret interrupted. "I am not his property. I am my own person, making my own choices. You can tell him that I am alive and well and where I choose to be. Tell him to stop searching. Tell him to let me go." Wheeler looked uncertain. "He'll never accept this. You know that, don't you? He'll keep sending men. He'll never stop looking. Then he will waste his life chasing a daughter who is already gone," Margaret said. "I cannot stop him from searching, but I will not return. Not now, not ever." She turned her back on Wheeler and walked back to where Nokosi waited, her heart pounding, but her steps steady. She half expected to hear a rifle shot, to feel a bullet, to have her father's reach extend even here. But Wheeler did not shoot. He and his men stood for a long moment in silence, then turned and left, disappearing back down the mountain. The crisis passed, but everyone knew it was not over. Wheeler would report back. Colonel Whitford would not accept his daughter's rejection. More men would come. That night, as Margaret lay with Nokosi, her hand on her swelling belly, she spoke the truth they both knew. "We will always be hunted," she said quietly. "As long as my father lives, as long as the bounty exists, we will never be truly safe." "No," Nokosi agreed. "We will not be safe, but we will be free, and we will be together. That is enough." Margaret thought about the woman she had been, the girl in silk dresses who had never questioned her privilege, who had accepted her future as inevitable. She thought about the snake bite that had started everything, about poison drawn out by copper hands and lips that saved her life. She thought about the choice she had made to run, and the harder choice to stay. "The venom saved me," she whispered, echoing the words carved into the stone by the river. "But love killed the person I was supposed to be, and I am grateful for it." Nokosi held her close, and they slept peacefully despite knowing that tomorrow might bring more hunters, more danger, more consequences for daring to love across boundaries that society insisted must never be crossed. Because some things were worth the risk, some choices were worth making even when they led to hardship. Some loves were worth dying for, and this was one of them. Years later, travelers passing through the Tennessee mountains would sometimes hear a story told by Cherokee people who remained hidden in the high valleys. They told of a white woman who had chosen to become Cherokee, who had worked and learned and earned her place among them. They told of her marriage to a man who had been exiled for showing mercy, and how their love had brought him home. They told of the children who came from that union, half Cherokee, half white, fully belonging to a new world that was slowly, painfully being born from the ashes of the old. And they told how the woman had grown old in those mountains, her hands rough with work, but her spirit unbroken, loved by a community she had chosen, and a man who had taught her what freedom really meant. The story became legend, and the legend reminded people that mercy could be stronger than hate, that love could survive impossible odds, that choosing your own path was worth any price. By the split oak where it all began, someone, no one knew who, carved new words beneath the old ones. Venom saved her, love killed us, but we died free. And the wind that whispered through those woods carried the names of two people who had refused to accept the world as it was and had built something better instead. Margaret and Nokosi, Ageha, my heart, forever.